and Tamika Butler, a founder, principal at Butler Consulting. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Ezra.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me see if y'all can see me here. Can you see me?
We can see you and your slides.
Okay, great. All right. So let's see. Do you want to like do the slides for me? Because I actually can't see where the remote. Okay, that's fine. So if you want to just start at the first slide there, I'm going to just talk a little bit around. If you go back to the first one, or the other direction. Other direction. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit around like what does equitable engagement look like during the pandemic, and start off with a little bit of context around this idea of intentional adaptation, which comes from Emergent Strategy, a book written by Adrienne Ray Brown, and it's basically its perspective around change, because the pandemic, what it did was cause a shock to our system, and it caused immense change at scale across the world. And what we can bank on, though, is that change will always be constant. And so the skills that we learn in adapting to change through the pandemic is a skill that we can apply regardless of if there's a pandemic, because there'll always be change. It may not look like a shock to the system, it may look like a shift. And another thing that we can always have our eye on is that when big change happens, from my personal experience, as well as kind of like in looking at the history of planning in general, one of the first things that gets cut is equity, because when timelines are running low on a project, or when a budget is too small for the work that needs to get done, we've seen time and time again that, oh, equity is a nice thing to have, but it's not necessary, so we're going to cut it. And so, that was one of our biggest concerns when the pandemic started. And so what I want to show you all is the process that Reflex takes to navigate change while maintaining integrity and maintaining those principles that we believe in, that we don't want to lose when these things happen. So you can go to the next slide here. So the three kind of pillars that Reflex works under is reflection, contextualization, and democratization. And these three things ground us in equity when there's big changes that are happening. And so it was very convenient, basically, that our three pillars were very kind of, ready when the pandemic hit. And so reflection is the process of starting off with a project, thinking about, and if you want, you can click to the next slide, looking at what is your positionality in this new context? How can you take stock of what is going on and your role in it, and any potential blind spots that you have? And so when it comes to the pandemic, it's thinking around, what has the pandemic changed? And what role can we play? And what blind spots might I have, especially as somebody who's white collar, and who may have not as great impacts because of my class privilege. And so what do I need to make myself aware of as this is going on? For example, how is this hurting other small businesses? How is this hurting unhoused folks? Things like that. And what is my role as somebody who is in the planning world and as a facilitator? What is my responsibility there? So you can go to the next slide. And the next piece here is contextualization. And so when we start a project, it's looking at the broader context that we are working within, the history, the social context, who has power, who doesn't have power. So through the lens of the pandemic, what we wanted to think about is, what is this new context around equity? What are the equity implications for the pandemic? And what can history teach us about what might happen during this pandemic that we haven't seen yet? And so in looking at history, for example, looking at Hurricane Katrina or other natural disasters, what we can see is that the people who are hurt the hardest are oftentimes low-income communities of color. And they're often hit the hardest, and they're some of the last to be helped. When it comes to aid, when it comes to government assistance, when it comes to like insurance companies coming in and helping. And so for us, the new context is that inequity will deepen because of this. The people who will lose their jobs first won't necessarily be white collar people. The people who will have access to the vaccines, as we're seeing now, will probably be, what we're seeing now is like in the US, we are able to have, relative ease in terms of being able to receive the vaccine depending on where you live. But at an international global scale, it's a lot of these poorer countries that are really struggling there. So what we can anticipate is that inequity will deepen. And if you want, you can go to the next slide here. And so after reflecting, after looking at context, the last thing we wanted to think about that's perhaps the most important is democratization. And that's our phase in our work when we take stock of what is our role, what is this new context, and how can we democratize our process and really see that those who are most impacted by this work have a seat at the table in navigating how we address this. So how can we work with those who would be most impacted to navigate this change? And so for the pandemic, that meant going back to the community partnerships we already had and asking them, okay, the community engagement that we were doing with you, it now needs to change because of the pandemic. And also it means that the project that we're working on has different implications. How can we work with you to adjust our plan? So if you want, you can go to the next slide. So to make this a little bit more concrete, the project we were working on with SFCTA, and you can see Paige in one of those photos, we were working on congestion pricing and studying whether or not congestion pricing as a tool for downtown San Francisco could be equitable, because it is charging a fee. And so this is some photos of us basically working on doing these workshops with folks as a part of our community engagement to see kind of how can we make this policy equitable. You can go to the next slide. And we also have a group of policy, basically policy, more like technical policy advisors. And so in talking to these two different stakeholder groups, once the pandemic hit, we were able to learn, what does accessibility look like now? And we found that oftentimes people can't use Zoom, they can't use video, so we can't just move our workshops online. And so we ended up, adjusting our entire process so that we could send people kits in the mail and then have them call in or join through video to be a part of the engagements that we had already planned. And so we were only able to come to those kinds of decisions by being able to call up our community partners and say, how can we adjust based off of what is accessible? So if you want, you can go to the next slide. This is a photo of sort of a hybrid workshop that was happening when the community partners are saying, like, we actually do in person. And so we did it over Zoom. We called in over Zoom, and then they had like a socially distanced workshop. So that was kind of like a custom approach that we did with one of our partners. And if you want, you can go to the next slide. And these are the kits that were sent in the mail. And so being able to work with these folks made all the difference. And then next slide. And so this is the not totally full list, but pretty close to full list of all the community partners we worked with on that specific project. Just to give you an idea of the folks that really had that expertise in helping us navigate this change and take stock of, okay, how are we going to do engagement now? So if I had one message to give you all around like what is equitable engagement, it's when you work with people who have that lived expertise in actually answering that question, because they will know best what equitable engagement means. So that is my 10 minutes.
Thanks, Ezra. Next up is Tiasia.
Hello, everyone. Let's see how this works. Okay, cool. So my name is Tiasia O'Brien. I am the founder and head of strategy over at Census. And we have a tech platform that focuses on public engagement. So we mostly work with government agencies, but also some consulting firms and corporations. And our goal is to take public engagement and transform that into insights. Before I get more into what our platform does, though, I want to talk a little bit about how we came to be. So I spent a decade working in the public sector, specifically in nonprofit organizations. And I often realized that when it came to major initiatives and major changes, communities were left out of the conversation. And it felt more of like there were community hearing meetings and opportunities for listening sessions. But a lot of community members that I knew weren't always able to attend those. And one of the biggest times I saw this was, I'm born and bred from Brooklyn, so the Barclays Arena opened up in downtown Brooklyn, and I had partnered with the organization I worked with, along with Forest City Ratner, and did a lot of initiatives around public engagement for that. And that was kind of like my first introduction to this particular problem of how do we get people to engage. More so, how do we make it equitable? Fast forward to 2018, and I decided that I was going to start this company, and I wanted to figure out what engagement can look like, but how do we scale it, and how do we make it equitable and accessible? So the first thing I did, along with my team, was we actually started just doing community engagement ourselves. So what you see here is a photo of us actually in the South Bronx at a community festival, and we were working to engage the public just around what their community needs were. We asked people to text us to see if that was a way that people would immediately give some feedback on what their community needs were, especially if they were in a rush, it didn't have the feasibility to stop, or they had a lot of like family members with them, so they didn't want to stop and play Jenga with us, which was our other means of gathering community input. With the Jenga pieces, we had different community elements. It's hard to see it because the picture is small, but you'll see public art, transit, urban gardens, community culture, public housing. All of those were listed on different blocks in the Jenga set with the goal of playing Jenga with people, but then also asking them, you know, as you're building your structure and trying to keep it stable, think very strategically about the pieces that you want to keep in or that you have to take out along the way. And so doing this over and over again in the Bay Area, in Kansas City, all over New York City, there are a few things we learned, and this is all things that we learned pre-pandemic because we did this all throughout 2018 and 2019. And one of them was language is critical. Whether you are speaking the same language in terms of English, Spanish, Vietnamese, or whether you're speaking the same language in terms of like local colloquial conversation. Community members often felt like when they were trying to be engaged, they were not speaking the same language as others, and that left them conflicted and confused. The second thing we learned is that being tracked is very triggering for marginalized community members. When I was doing community engagement in Inwood, which is the northernmost part of Manhattan, a highly diverse neighborhood with mostly a Dominican population. One of the people I spoke to said, look, I served in Vietnam. I am more than happy to answer any questions that the government has for me. I do not want to give my personal information. I gave all I have to give already. So that really made me understand that being tracked is triggering when we're tracking certain data points when it comes to community members. The third thing is that when it comes to really having an opportunity to engage people, offering options is key. People often felt blocked in because if they were offered A through D options in some type of survey, they felt like, well, I'm only restricted to what the person who is giving me these options are. I don't have the right, or I'm not given leeway to kind of put in my own opinion or my own solution for an idea in a community that I live in and that I grew up in. So all of that kind of informed how we would design our product Co-Census and became some of the cornerstones of what we were designing with. And this was all before the pandemic. So when the pandemic kicked in, all of this really became even more influential in what we do. So Co-Census, how we operate in terms of community engagement, is really centered on the things that I mentioned. The first thing that we do is we prioritize text message surveys, which are completely accessible for everyone in the community. And we also gather data on smartphone accessibility that is available in different cities. And I'll talk more about that later. But the ability to connect with people via text message makes it seamless and easy for them. And we also translate surveys into multiple languages. So you can see something like this in English, Spanish, simplified Chinese, Filipino. We have up to 10 languages, and all languages are by request. But the priority about this is really the fact that we're engaging people and coming to them and meeting people where they are, regardless of what language they speak. And we really try to highlight the fact that surveys should be aimed at being conversational. I also wanted to drop one link in here as I was talking about this, and I'm dropping it to the chat. Reading this research from Chicago Beyond, a nonprofit that's focused on how marginalized communities always feel like they're being too researched, was also very informative for me and my team as we thought about equitable engagement. So text message became one of the key ways that we started engaging communities. And we started playing around with this idea in very early 2020, right as the pandemic kicked off. And it just so happens that as the pandemic kicked off, the world kind of became a lot more aware of digital inclusion. And so that's when we really started focusing on, let's see if I'm able to move that there. Might be having some trouble with the slides. Okay, I think I'm having a few hiccups with the slides, but what we were able to do is gather enough data to create these digital inclusion hubs, which became a priority conversation for a lot of cities across the country. And that's where we highlight different demographics in each of the cities that we're live in, but also provide the opportunity to give you more understanding of how many people in a respective community have access to smartphones, and also how many people are actually engaging using smartphones. And this is all data we've gathered and sourced and make accessible to anyone who's interested in it. And I think the final piece that I want to mention is how we specifically have worked with a lot of transit agencies across the country through workshops and cohorts. And so in our transit equity program, some of the organizations we've worked with are in Maryland, Baltimore, Seattle, Connecticut. What we specifically aim to do is put people together in conversation to talk about community engagement and some of the hiccups that they have throughout the process, but also working with the Urban Institute, we're able to think about equity assessments and think about how those can be redesigned to be more inclusive. And these are just a few of the agencies we worked with. And that is all I have. Thank you. I will drop another link to share a little bit more about customer stories and some of the impacts that our focus on equitable engagement has had.
Awesome. Thanks, Tiasia. All right, we're going to bring it back to some local community organizing with Kristen.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And I think I already mentioned this, but I've taken one of those surveys and they're incredible and the best survey I've taken. So definitely appreciate the work that you're doing there. All right, I'm going to see if I can figure out this technology. 1 second, everyone. Okay, perfect. So my name is Kristen Lecke, and I'm a senior community organizer on staff at the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. So essentially, I work on any bike or pedestrian project that city agencies have proposed in the city. And I see my role as basically helping the community access the bureaucratic process, which can be a lot to handle. And basically, I am trying to help build them into advocates so that eventually I won't have a job because they're great advocates and they've been built up to be able to advocate for what they need in their communities. So community outreach is the main part of my job, and I was on the ground. So when COVID-19 happened, I had a big moment, a big question of what does community outreach look like virtually. So I have a lot of learnings, a lot of pros, a lot of cons to it. But first, I wanted to start off with some major wins that we had in the past year or so. So in San Francisco, we saw the launch of a Slow Streets program, and we also saw park spaces being closed to cars and opened up to people. So for those who might not know, Slow Streets are a low-cost way to limit through traffic on residential streets, so folks could use those as a shared space for walking, biking, or rolling. So those alongside open park spaces kind of created or provided a safe and comfortable outdoor space for people to, one, socially distance safely, but while doing that, taking much needed time outside, whether that was for recreation, mental health, we were stuck indoors all the time, or if folks had to do essential activities like go to work, go to the doctor, get groceries, etc. And I think the biggest impact I would say on these programs was I saw people kind of co-creating community spaces. My example is I live in Oakland and I have a lot of both seniors and toddlers on my street. And so this was the first time I've seen kids playing in the actual street. And I was able to meet so many of my neighbors who I had not met beforehand. So, but that was only able to happen because we got a slow street. Our street beforehand was kind of a thoroughfare for fast moving traffic. So I saw a lot of folks really learning to enjoy the space and not necessarily have to fear for that through traffic that was there before. So I wanted to show a few photos or examples. So this one right here is the Great Highway. And this was closed at the beginning of pandemic, and it became a place for folks to bike, walk. We also saw a lot of creation and installation of art and continue to see it in the space. And in this picture, we see protests. So the space has also become a place where people are gathering to protest. This specific one is from the George Floyd uprising last year, which brought hundreds, if not thousands of people actually to the Great Highway and gave them a space to be able to safely protest. And we continue to see it and see more protests happening as the space continues to be open to folks. Of course, we also saw, this is JFK Drive in Golden Gate Park, which had weekend closures already. But what we saw is that the closure was put in place 24/7 every day of the week. And then we also saw a lot of folks, like I said, creating art and kind of decorating the spaces that they now had on their actual streets. So folks started to create pieces like this. to kind of personalize their own spaces. Oops, so sorry. But the big caveat here is that they weren't perfect, especially slow streets, which really was launched as a one-size-fits-all approach initially, and it wasn't equitably distributed across the city either. It actually took community activists and activism to fix issues with slow streets and even do the bare minimum of holding people accountable to actually putting them in desperately needed neighborhoods. So they were also created under an emergency order, which meant that they were able to be implemented without any community input or feedback beforehand. And so one of the communities we saw who fought really hard for over 6 months to get any slow streets or similar treatments in their neighborhood was the Tenderloin, which is one of our densest neighborhoods, which also has very little outdoor or green space. It also has one of the highest numbers of families and seniors in the city. And yet the city said that the barricades and the one-size-fits-all approach wasn't enough to create space given the freeway arterials that the streets basically serve as, which is a whole other issue in itself. But essentially we have really unsafe streets and almost no outdoor space. And people had to advocate for over 6 months to get any sort of outdoor space during a health pandemic. So this is just one photo from one of the many protests and demonstrations that happened in the Tenderloin. And my coworker, Claire Amable, works in the Tenderloin in Soma and did amazing work the past year in the TL. The Bike Coalition itself, in response to the initial program, we asked that the city immediately develop and implement a strategy for TL slow streets. We asked that list of slow streets be prioritized for the densest neighborhoods. We asked that the city could create a process for communities to engage in slow streets and develop community ownership. So neighborhoods could advocate for the inclusion and could advocate for themselves on which streets would fit best for them. And we also asked to limit law enforcement and asked for no enforcement and instead to rely on actual infrastructure signage and voluntary compliance instead. And then on my end, I had to move all of my on the ground outreach online. So in that process, we lost a lot of important voices in the conversation, especially folks like essential workers, houseless folks, and those without access to reliable internet. So I mentioned my coworker, Claire. She launched a pilot project to create community alternatives to traffic enforcement in the Tenderloin. Like I mentioned, every street in the neighborhood is actually on the high injury network. We know that speeding kills, and last year the police department only issued 5 speeding tickets in the neighborhood, but yet the neighborhood has the highest concentration of jaywalking tickets in the city and is over 70% non-white residents. We also know that we've seen too many examples locally and nationally where traffic stops have led to the murdering of Black and brown people. So that was really important to keep in mind when advocating for traffic enforcement in communities of color locally, especially in the Tenderloin. So our goal was to figure out a way to create safe streets without relying on police in the Tenderloin and figuring out outreach during a pandemic to do that work. And so what we found out was after initial virtual surveys, we weren't reaching houseless neighbors at all. And so we had to reassess and ended up doing on the ground outreach along with that in order to reach those folks who are disproportionately impacted by enforcement in the TL. We also saw city officials and agencies working with community-based organizations to get the word out about new projects, which Ezra mentioned, creating packets that were going out to folks. Those were going out in grocery deliveries, if people are delivering medicine to seniors, folks like that. But at the same time, we did see new voices joining the conversation and projects happening in ways that some folks are able to access when they weren't able to before. So with open houses, people now had two weeks to look over the material, ask questions of I could help answer, and then give their feedback. I also saw a lot of senior and disability advocates who were able to actually attend meetings because they were virtual. And I can't not acknowledge that those of us who are chronically ill and or disabled finally saw accommodations happening that previously we were told were too much. It also provided a way to do some digital organizing. And I saw a lot of younger folks take part because we are doing more on social media. And then just to wrap it up, some lessons I think we can take into 2021 and beyond. Virtual outreach is not enough, but it can provide an essential way to reach folks who can't access in-person meetings or city hearings. It should be looked at as a way to enhance outreach, but not replace on-the-ground outreach. We need to place equity at the forefront and be willing to revise projects given community feedback. And we really need to be working with the communities to shape the projects planners want to bring to them, which we saw with feedback on Slow Streets itself. That is all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristen. All right, so before I pass it off to Tamika, just quick note that Tamika is our last panelist, and then we will have Q&A, and we will have time for audience questions, and you should be thinking about those and be ready to put them in the chat. But first, I will pass it off to Tamika.
Great, thank you. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. And hopefully you all are seeing that in presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll take it. Okay, so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's always hard to follow up after so many amazing folks, and I know it's the end of the day. So I will keep it to my 10 minutes and make it as light as I possibly can. So first, I always like to just note that I am on native land. I'm Tamika. I live in Los Angeles. And I think it's really important for us to always identify that and beyond that, to do the work to figure out whose land we're on, and to not just do these land acknowledgement, but start to meaningfully couple thinking about native land with authentic relationships and really informed action. And so with that, and I am on Tonga land. And so with that, a little bit about who I am. I'm from Nebraska, which always surprises people if they've never heard me speak before, because they are shocked that there are Black people there, and there are. A lot of folks haven't been to Nebraska, especially coastal folks, but you should know that we are the home of the good life. Even if you hadn't heard of us before, many people heard of us in the last year or so, because we are a place where people will go and freeze at an airport. But we also have a very important presidential district that helped decide the election. And that is actually where I'm from, Sarpy County. And so my parents and my family are mixed somewhere up in these stats. At some point, I felt really gay and really Black and wanted to leave the Midwest. And I actually moved to the Bay, and I went to law school, which I absolutely, I can't say love, but can't say hate. But I went to law school at Stanford, and I remember being a small town Nebraskan girl thinking, I'm moving to the Bay Area from Nebraska. I'm going to the gay Mecca, and being shocked that Palo Alto was not that, but also shocked that San Francisco was not that for Black lesbians. But then I discovered Oakland, and it was game over. But before I get into my personal life too much, I will just say that after I graduated from law school, I opened a workers' rights clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, right when the T-line had just started in Bayview Hunters Point. And just hearing from so many community residents who didn't necessarily want to talk to me about their legal issues, but wanted to talk to me about the fact that they didn't feel like anybody had talked to them or planned for them when it came to this Muni line. They really felt like it was for tourists who wanted to see the San Francisco 49ers play. So that really opened me up to a new love of transportation. And I was lucky enough to become the executive director at the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition, join boards like Transit Center, and most recently, I worked at a private consulting firm, Tool Design, with a few folks on this call. It's a little bit of a tool design reunion, and I learned a lot there. But what I learned more than anything is that last year was hard. Last year was really hard for all of us. And in my role as the director of equity and inclusion, where I was doing both internal work at the firm and external work, helping our clients think more equitably, and being a Black, queer, gender non-conforming person in society with all that was happening every year, but especially last year, it was just a lot to also hold that space for everybody at my firm and hold that space for folks I really adored and cherished. But I needed to take a step back and do something for myself. And so I started my own consulting firm, not quite a year ago, but almost a year ago. And I've been really lucky to have a variety of government clients and professional organizations. I've also gotten to do a lot of freelance writing, and I do a lot of emerging mobility and engagement work. Like here, an engagement process we did with Spin and San Francisco about how to make their services more equitable. And then I also, my first love is being from a nonprofit. And so I get to work with nonprofits in a number of ways and help write reports and work on projects that are near and dear to my heart. And then I do a lot of public speaking, just like I'm doing here. And so the project I want to talk about specifically is one of the projects that makes me ask the question I always ask about transportation and planning, but whether or not this is a white space. Spoiler alert, it is. And so last year, I was really, really lucky. In the summer of 2020, NACDO launched a brand new initiative called the Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. And the whole point of this initiative was to help cities who are trying to figure out what to do during a pandemic, figure out how to design their streets better. I got to work with one of my friends and colleagues, Naomi Iwasaki, who had her own consulting firm at the time, but is now at LA Metro and their equity office. And we were hired to provide technical assistance and coaching to grantees. And the reality was we gave money to 10 cities and they did things like outdoor dining programs, slow street programs that you just heard of, and community and mobility hubs. And they were really trying to balance how do we rapidly implement recovery efforts with meaningful, equitable community partnerships and shared ownerships of the programs. And so that was really, one of the big challenges of the program. But the reality is that we were helping these cities think of new practices, but what we always try to caution the cities in our coaching work is that new planning practices might just be building on existing inequities, and that might just intensify old disparities and create new ones at the same time. And you've heard some of my colleagues already speak about that during their slides. And so, we've seen this for generations, but it's true that things that could seem like progressive planning efforts might really just be made by people in decision-making positions who are still looking through their own lens, which centers whiteness and wealth. And so when you think about the work we do in transportation, transportation is very similar to many institutions in many sectors. Transportation leadership is predominantly composed of white, cisgendered, straight, able-bodied men. And these leaders are often making decisions without incorporating or listening to the perspectives of Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, people with disability, queer folks who have historically been oppressed and continue to be oppressed and are marginalized. And those folks have unique needs, but they also have unique strengths. They have unique priorities. And when cities aren't listening to those people, and when those people don't fit the decision-making roles, you know, cities just continue to uphold the status quo, and they have processes and policies that continue to prioritize and center whiteness. And so that was something that we tried to help these places understand. And we really tried to have conversations about whiteness in planning. We tried to remind people that when you engage in planning practices that center whiteness, you may be planning in ways that folks think are including basic perspectives and experiences and making something, you know, manipulating infrastructure for the everyman. But in reality, those folks are just planning based on experiences of place and space that are only afforded to those who are able to experience those places and spaces in white bodies. And I think a great example from this is something we just heard about, something I worked on in this project, but a great example of this disconnect happened last year with the widespread implementation of an expansion of slow streets and safe streets projects, right? They were supposed to repurpose underused and underutilized public space, but all of this was happening, and it happened here in LA. This is a picture of my street as a slow street. And this was all happening in the context, literally, the New York Times were writing stories about this while Black people were mourning another life loss from a young Black man who was running and was shot on what was foreseeably a slow street. Sure, not officially closed and named such, but slow enough so that he could run on. And so I think when people think about these policies, both during the pandemic, but even after it, we have to think about not just planning while white, but we have to understand that in addition to slow streets, we have to be doing engagement, not outreach. Outreach is just going out and saying, here's what I think we should do. What do you guys think? Engagement is really being open to the fact that what you want may be different. And I think that's why in Oakland, they went from just slow streets to slow streets essential places. And it's going out and trusting local people as the experts they are, realizing that a grandmother who sits on her stoop or the kids who hang out on the corner know a ton about their street, even if they're not at a fancy consulting firm. It's really believing in partnership and really understanding that partnership comes in many forms, but all partnership is not created equal. It's really bad when you have no community partners. That's that last point. But it's just as bad for communities if you have that middle situation where you have strong community partnerships, but weak coordination between departments or consulting teams. If you're trying to plan something and you have community partnerships, but you keep asking these people to come to 14 meetings and they're like, wait, why couldn't you guys coordinate behind the scenes and just have one meeting? That's still a problem. And so the best is making sure you have strong community partnerships and then strong coordination between whoever you have working on a project. That's the most important thing. I'll just wrap with my last few thoughts, which are, we have to incorporate equity through partnership. We have to define and commit to equity, not just when there's a pandemic or a crisis, but like yesterday, we have to get on it. As soon as we make those partnerships, we have to identify the pressure points, both for those organizations, what are their capacities, what can they do? But it's also always important, who can say no to shut down this project? Where are the pressure points, the pain points? I've already said not waiting into a crisis to develop partnerships, but really developing trust. And again, having those capacity conversations upfront. Are you paying enough? Are you having meetings at the right time? Can this organization do this work? And even if they can't do it the way you envision it, can they still be helpful and can you adjust to make that happen? And then how do you make sure these folks are the leaders and that they're getting paid for the expertise that they provide? Once we do that, we can start to understand that power isn't something you just wield like a sword, right? That's how we think of power, something you hold over people. But we have to start thinking about power with people. How do we co-power the folks we're partnering with? And really, again, not just pay them, but really help them lead. And for me, I always think about equity and equality. I always think about this picture. I hate this picture, even though it helps people understand that equity means, even though it helps people understand that equity means that some people may get something and some people won't. It doesn't show the reality of where we're starting with. And beyond that, I think where we should be trying to get, which is to liberation. I think we all want a place, like I do transportation work because I want folks to be able to move freely and effortlessly with dignity wherever they go. And so I don't want to just help people see under a fence. I want to tear the fence down. And beyond that, I just don't want to make people watch a baseball game or ride in a bike lane if they don't want to. I want to hear from people what they want. I want to hear from people if they don't want to watch a baseball game, but they want to own a team. I want to hear from people if they don't like baseball. And once we start thinking in that way, that's where we think of co-powering, because co-powering is actually sharing some of that power and allowing people to have some self-determination. And so if you're in an organization that wants to do this work, I always say, you know, if you want to tear down those fences, you have to first create brave spaces, which are totally different than safe spaces. We sometimes say we want a safe space, but for many of us, we never feel safe in this world. And so we want to create those spaces where we can have brave conversations and push back when things seem inequitable. And frankly, where folks can mess up and say the wrong things and not be afraid to do that, but then take accountability for it, hold space for the harm that has been caused, because it's not about your intent, it's about the actual effect, and then keep moving. And then you have to understand the role that power plays in whatever you're proposing, right? And if you want to understand the role that power plays, and if you have a power dynamic, whenever you're thinking of a new project, new infrastructure, new program, new policy, ask yourself, who's going to be most impacted by this? And then look around the decision-making table and say, are those people here? And if the answer is no, then you know you have a power imbalance. And then it's time to analyze and challenge. Well, who has the privilege to be here and why? Is it because of the time of our meeting? Is it because of the requirements we put in the job description? Is it because this costs money? And once you start to analyze and challenge that privilege, that's how you can not only make institutional change, but make sure that whatever changes you hope to make to be more thoughtful in your engagement are actually equitable and actually contemplate whether or not power is being shared. And so with that, I will just say thank you. I believe that is my 10 minutes and hopefully not too much more. And I will turn it back over.
Thank you, Tamika. I feel like we really just came full circle there with your points about taking back power and Ezra's point at the beginning about reflection, contextualization, and democratization. So that was a really nice circle you just connected us on. I'm going to invite Kristen and Tiasia and Ezra to come back on video and join us. And we're going to now move on to Q&A. And man, I had some questions that I shared beforehand and just so many more popped into my head. So thank you all for just filling up my brain right now. One thing, and it connected well with what you said at the end, Tamika, about we don't want to be building on planning practices and policies that are rooted in a space of whiteness and inequality. And so what is one, and there are so many, but what is one habit, as one word to use, that as a profession and kind of as a planning or as a space that community engagement leaders in planning should just leave behind right now? Like, what is one thing we do consistently that we just should stop doing? And is there, the flip side of that, is there one thing you've learned within your work that we should always do? I don't want to simplify it, but it, as just a takeaway from this panel, kind of what are there things in each of those buckets that you would recommend? And anyone can start. I think, Tamika, you have yourself already unmuted if you have some thoughts.
I think one thing you can always do is talk to people. I always say if somebody comes in as a consultant and says, here's our equity toolkit, here you go, then they're probably not the folks you want to go with. I think all of us on this panel have said some version of talk to the people who actually you're hoping to serve and get their opinions. And then one thing I think we should leave behind, I mean, I think for me, it's the way we ghettoize equity work to only be engagement work. And so we think that the only time equity should come up is when you're talking about engagement. And then, you know, you're on a project and engagement is task 7. And then you bring in the engagement people and they're like, okay, but you've already done all of these things that were based on your assumptions. And so I think we have to make sure that equity is part of every project at every step, and that we don't ghettoize it to just engagement. And then frankly, we don't ghettoize our staff of color, our queer staff, our staff with disability to only be engagement people.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. We, at Fehr and Peers, when we started our kind of discipline group thinking about equity, every single call was completely dominated by community engagement discussion, which was great. But every time we got to the end and said, we didn't discuss any other parts of our equity work that we need to do. And so we created a separate group to discuss, but still have the interdepartmental coordination that you mentioned. But yeah, that is, I really like that point. Other thoughts, yeah, from the panel on this one? Habits to leave behind or incorporate in every project?
Yeah, I think one habit to leave behind is the way we think about expertise. I think a lot of the times people think about like technical expertise, for lack of a better term, and they don't think about how robust and critical and nuanced lived expertise is. And so really, you know, seeing that as for what it is and respecting it when community members are, you know, coming to the table. And then I think in terms of, you know, one thing to learn is it's sort of like exactly that, but it's once we recognize that lived expertise is a thing, and it's actually thinking about, you know, okay, so they are experts, so how come only the technical experts are getting paid to do work? Who gets to be the one that's leading this project? Who gets to be the one that's professionalized? Who gets the job? Who gets the benefits? It's generally always the technical experts. And so how can we start to shift that that dynamic?
I would say maybe one habit to leave behind is maybe similar to what you're saying, Ezra, is this reliance on data and presenting data to the community. Whether that is, you know, data showing how many stakeholders you've done outreach to, how many community meetings you met as markers you have to check off in order to like say this project's ready to go and get approved. Or if it's an open house with a board full of data that is really wonky and doesn't really get to or doesn't really talk about people's lived experiences. And so I think there's a reliance on data versus people's lived experiences and actually listening to folks and what they want to see, what their concerns are, and just the thresholds that come with data. And then I think one habit and one thing I especially like, I will say like personally, and I think other white folks in the field need to be doing a lot of internal work around anti-racism and doing all of that for sure. And I would also say that we need to be going to the community and recognizing they're the experts and we're the ones to be learning. And also like basics, just like have food at that evening meeting that someone, you know, ran over to. Like there's never food at meetings, like just basics, you know?
Do you have a burning answer for this one, Tiasia? I'm seeing some good questions come through the chat that I can put out there, but I want to give you a chance.
Oh, no, I think we can hop over to our next question. I think I agree with everything that was said. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so one question that is coming through the chat gets to this, there's a couple actually related. So, you know, Tamika, you're saying we need to talk to people, really hear what the community is saying. Tiasia, you shared how also underrepresented communities are always asking, why are we being studied over and over again? Same thing, like, is there too much outreach happening? What are ways that we can talk to people, listen to what they're saying, you know, value their time? Maybe one option is paying them, but how can we also limit the number of times we come to the community, but increase their impact in shaping our projects?
I'll quickly jump in. I get this question often from a few government agencies, and I don't think it's necessarily having to limit the times. I think it's being really conscientious of the how you're going about having conversations with communities. I think from my experience, it has been a lot less of conversations and more of a like, here's a survey, here's this thing. It's like always like this like one side approach of like, we need this information, we want it back from you. Up too late, like you weren't able to give it to us, sorry. And those are things that I saw like time and time over again, especially in revitalizing communities or where there's a major shift happening. I think the thing that isn't often thought about is the approach and the how. How can you make engagement a consistent conversation that happens? And it's not just every time you need to have some type of significant change. One of the things that I like to think about is like, well, why aren't we doing more conversations in like barbershops and bodegas and places where like, I think we structure the public forum to always be like, oh, it's a community hearing meeting. And like, from a very honest standpoint, I am an Afro-Latina woman. Like, that was never my public forum. My public forum was at the bodega. That's where I spoke to the local mayor and like, I got all the local news on the block. So like, how do we, without taking over those spaces, because there is ownership by the people who live there, how do you become a part of that conversation and facilitate conversations there instead of constantly asking people to come to you? Because then it feels like less of a like, oh, like, here they come again type situation, and more of a like, oh, here's one of our like partners. Like it's about that. I think Tamika said like the co-part, like that co-power, like that's the part that really needs to be done with a lot of conscious thought.
Yeah, what other thoughts do people have here? And there was a specific question also about, are paid partnerships usually a government thing, or does anybody know of consulting firms or other organizations that have attempted this? Yeah.
So I think one, I think if there are folks on the call who work at government, something I always like to say is, is this a thing a certain type of entity does? Well, all of these entities are made up of people. So people made decisions to not do it. And I think sometimes when we do equity work, we want a big and sexy success that you can have a press conference and this, that, and the other. But like changing procurement practices is sexy as hell. Like it could totally change the game on equity. So I think whether or not governments do it, they should. I think there are governments who do it. Our DOT does it here. San Jose is doing it on a project I'm working with them on. Now, I think often they have an intermediary. So I think often they're paying a consulting firm that is then paying these community members or community groups, or they'll, have a consulting firm that has a larger nonprofit then partner with different people in the community. But I also think it's as small as like, if people do your survey, what are you giving them to do the survey? Like, I think we have to start valuing people's time as expertise. And so I totally agree with what was just said. Like the way my mama would say it is, don't waste people's time, right? And I think that's, we often, I think as planners and as transportation folks say, how can we bring people to our table? How can we make our table as inclusive as possible? And what you just heard was, maybe it's not your table. Like they already have a table. And why is it that we want those folks to come into our spaces and feel uncomfortable and feel like they have to learn a new language we're getting paid. So we should be the ones who have to go to the Black barbecue and be like, I don't know if I should be here. But like figure it out, right? And so, and I guarantee that's what your colleagues of color are doing in these white spaces anyway. Like they have to do it at work. You can do it at work too, is part of your job. So.
Yeah, where there's a will, there's a way to do it. I mean, this past year has been a lesson in that. Whenever if something didn't work, we just, this is how it's always done is no longer a valid reason after we've seen that everyone could shift the way they operate during COVID, if nothing else. Yeah, other ways that we can just we can better value and the community's time.
Yeah, I think like something tangible to help it could be, it's very tied to what everyone has been saying is, if you don't know what their table is, like start off your project by going to a community-based organization and asking them, okay, this is a conversation we're interested in having. Like, how can we make that accessible? Like, where could we host it? Are there pre-existing gatherings that we can go to or pre-existing meetings? What kind of food do people like? What else would make this accessible? Like translation, childcare, and like compensation. Actually, like Reflex, we don't commit to any project with a client unless they are ready to commit to compensating community members. So that's just never not on the table, because I think that's just it's like a baseline that's needed. And so I think there's like a question, is like a paid partnerships usually a government thing? It should be. It should be. So setting aside budget, I know that there's like government, like if it's federally funded, there's like particular restrictions on how you can use that money. So there's like bureaucratic hurdles to pass, which, as kind of Tamika is touching on, can be a very sexy thing to work on. Is how do we navigate those bureaucratic, hurdles around compensating people, whether it's the CBO that's co-hosting a workshop with us, as well as the community members that come to those workshops, or have a one-on-one interview. And I also know that like SFCTA, like Paige, you would have it. I know I'm not calling out, but it would be an interesting thing for like people who have navigated that bureaucracy, how if they made that work, because I know that there's a lot of restrictions around funding.
Thanks, Ezra. So asking to pay everyone, and another thing that came up in a lot of your talking points for all the panelists was, being able to customize your approach to fit the community's needs. Or in your example, Kristen, of slow streets, the one size fit all approach didn't work for everyone and didn't work for all communities. And so needing to customize that. And I'm just seeing the decision makers at our various organizations saying, well, that's just too time intensive, too costly. How do we do a better job convincing the decision makers and the people controlling, the budgets for engagement projects, that the outcomes of not putting that effort and time in on the front end are also costly? It's just, I think you said this at the beginning, Ezra, that equity is always like, well, it'd be nice to have it, but it gets left out so often. How do we make that just, a non-negotiable and substantial part of our planning process? I know that's a big question. It's just constantly something I feel I'm fighting against, is no, it's really worth paying all this money up front because you're going to get a better project, a happier community. in the long run?
That's a huge question, and I don't know if I have a great answer, but I think it comes in part from advocacy within these agencies, and that not being the BIPOC folks on staff. I think that white folks on staff really need to be advocating for that. And maybe this goes back to the previous question around like, how do you know how much is enough outreach? If you know you're working in a specific neighborhood and you aren't doing one-on-one conversations with community-based organizations or like, community members that people look up to and like look to for information, and you have no sense of their self-interest and like what would bring them to the table, I don't know if we're at the point to bring a project to the community then, or even bring the process. And it makes me think a lot around community-based transportation plans that the MCA has started to do, especially in the Bayview, and steering committees, and getting local folks, compensating them and having them actually building the process and giving their expertise on how to bring the community into the space, is extremely important.
I love that. I think that could be a good way to end our night, is if you're not ready to do meaningful community engagement, your project is not ready. So I'm going to pass it back to Paige because we've reached the end of our time, sadly. This was fantastic. Thank you, panelists, and thanks for everyone. So Paige.
Yeah, thanks everyone. On behalf of the YPT San Francisco board, we were so glad to see you all here tonight, and thank you to our panelists for all of your really great storytelling, lessons learned, and wisdom. And I will throw our membership and sponsorship links in the chat for all of you who may want to sponsor us or who may want to join, so you can attend future events like this. So have a great night, everyone, and we'll see you soon.